Hi guys, and welcome to Mastering V-Ray Lesson 8 Part 2. You'll notice I recently skipped ahead to creating Lesson 9 instead of creating this lesson, and that was simply because I wasn't happy with the results I was achieving out of V-Ray when trying to make snow. After spending quite a bit of time using various methods to reproduce it, I kind of eventually hit a dead end and had to look outside the box for answers on how to create more detailed and photorealistic snow, and I ended up resorting to using Octane to create the effect and learn more about how snow works because I had that real-time feedback. The problem is that by the time I'd gotten those results out of Octane, Lesson 9 was overdue, so I skipped ahead to buy myself a bit more time with this lesson, and I'm happy to say I'm pretty pleased with the results. But unfortunately, I couldn't achieve the same kind of realism that I was getting out of Octane. So because of that, I'll also include a basic rundown of how I achieved it there also. And hopefully in the future, I'll be able to devote a full course to Octane because it is a really cool render engine. It is, like, I can't say it enough. It is such a fun render engine to use when you've got I've obviously got those two titans working with it. And having that real-time feedback, it's just insane. You can just layer up as many shaders as you want, all in real time. There's real-time displacement, real-time subsurface. It just made things so much easier. And then when I jumped back in V-Ray, it kind of felt like I was, kind of 10 years in the past. Now, even though I think it's really awesome, it isn't fully production ready yet. There's some limitations that I'm not, that happy with at the moment that I feel like should be in the render engine by now. But until those are there, I won't be creating that course. But hopefully you guys get a little bit excited for that once you kind of see what's possible in the engine when you do have a couple of really fast cards working on it. So to get started, the first thing I'm going to do is set up a quick scene that includes a basic ocean and iceberg object. The modeling and detail isn't at a production level, but it should help to demonstrate the different effects that can be achieved with the V-Ray SSS2 shader that we're going to be predominantly using in this lesson. I also got asked a few times how to set up Ocean, and although I'll save a detailed breakdown of that for my lighting course, what I'm about to show you is pretty standard these days and will get the job done and looks pretty good. I'm sure you all know about Phoenix FD, but one cool feature the demo has is that available for free is a great displacement map that uses the Tessendorf algorithm to produce waves using displacement. I've recently seen guys like Peter Guthrie and Bertrand Benoit using it a lot, and in all the years I've been trying to create oceans, this is the quickest and easiest solution so far. So let me just quickly run through the scene for you and show you what I've got set up, and then we'll just work through some of the points I want to get across to you when you are working with this fast SSS2 shader. So you can see from the latest render I've got up here that the end result looks pretty good, but the thing that's letting it down the most is the lack of detail in the model. So if you put the effort into creating that nice detailed geometry, the shader will do the work for you. I've just set it up to a point where it looks realistic enough where you can see all the effects happening, but without having to go in and spend days sculpting a really detailed surface. So like I was saying earlier, we've just got a very simple scene. It's, as usual, it's just got one dome light lighting the scene. We've got the iceberg here, which has just kind of been slapped together. I've got underneath the ocean surface, the iceberg gets bigger, and that's so we can see the underwater effect happening and how the water itself has that blue fog color applied. At the base I have a V-Ray plane just to block the HDR from coming through at the base, and then on the top I've just got a simple plane with a square number of subdivisions and a V-Ray displacement over the top with a Phoenix FD texture. So because I've installed the Phoenix FD demo, you'll see here that you get a couple of different textures available, and one of those is the Phoenix FD Ocean texture. So if you just use that, if you haven't set it up before, when you do apply that texture to the surface in the displacement mod, V-Ray will ask you if you want to change some settings, because it's quite a unique map in that it's a vector displacement. So when you are using it, down the bottom here, you will need to set up a couple of settings if it hasn't already done it for you in order for that displacement to come through. So in displacement, you'll need to set it to tangent. You can change the edge length of your pixels to determine how detailed you want that to come through. And I usually use a pretty low amount on the ocean. If you go any higher, the ocean starts to look really rough. And when you do create a really rough ocean, you have to start adding in extra features like height-based coloring and crests on the wave, and it makes things a little bit more complicated to set up when you do have a more rough ocean. So for this scene, I've just kept things simple. You can see in our reference, most of the time where there is icebergs, the water is quite calm without much detail. But when you do go to a bigger scale, obviously then you'll have to start increasing that displacement amount to get an effect like this. I should also note that the bigger the iceberg becomes, the more diffuse it appears on the surface, and you're losing that SSS effect. You can see down the bottom that we still have that green color tint coming through, but it's nowhere near as prevalent as, say, a small scene like this, where you can literally see that blue glow coming through. So this particular scene, we've got an iceberg that's a similar size to this, probably about 10 to 15 meters across max, and going underwater about 20 meters or so. So in the ocean, in the Phoenix FD ocean texture, there's a couple of settings I've got here to create this effect. And you can see it's all real time when you change this, so it's quite easy to use. Feel free to just experiment. The first thing I want to point out is the level of detail. And if I just go down here, let me just bring it all the way down. You can start to see, similar to when we're working with Burcon and we increase the levels, where we're adding an extra level, it's kind of just adding another layer of detail at half the size and half the intensity. With Ocean, you can see if you go up, after a while, it starts to become a little bit less noticeable. So even though we're only at 6 levels of detail here, we're seeing a pretty large area being displaced. So if we zoomed in on one point here, we'd notice that even though we can't see it now, more detail is actually coming through. For this particular scene, I've set the level of detail to 12 because that's when I stop noticing that extra little bit. I've kept the wave height at 1 and I've made it quite sharp. You can see if I go down on the sharpness here also, it's just going to create a softer ocean surface and a calmer ocean surface. And usually this will work more for something like lakes, where you're not getting a strong wind direction coming through, creating those peaks on the waves. It's more just the rippling effect of the water itself. So like I was saying, I've got the sharpness set up quite high. And I'll just do a quick render through with some different settings in a second, but I'm just running you through. The velocity coherence will affect the straightness of the waves and how strong that wind is pushing in one direction. So the lower we go here, you can see the waves start to ripple and kind of wobble in a more even way. So there's not one little bit of there's not one little bit of wind pushing the whole surface through. If you were to create a larger ocean scene, you probably would want to go higher on that, because once I'm not sure exactly how the physics behind it work, but once you get a bit of gust of wind pushing the wave, it's blocking the next wave from that wind, and you end up with just a very strong directional effect happening. But because we're in a calm area in this particular scene, like I was saying, I've just got it down so you can see the effect is a little bit more random and chaotic. The last thing is the wave crest. And as you go down, once again, you're producing a similar effect to just standard water. not on a large scale where you are just getting those even ripples in distribution. So for this scene, to create a more ocean-like appearance, I've just gone a bit higher. So let me just duplicate this displacement map and I'll show you the difference that can make. Because I do have a plane set up here that's not extremely massive, so the displacement's running really slow. When I do change the camera angle, I've just moved the plane so that we're seeing a little bit more into the distance. In terms of the render settings in the scene, once again, I do have divide shading subdivs turned off, so you'll see that there's quite low subdivs on everything once we get to that. But it's a similar render setup to the previous lesson you were seeing in the environment fog. So let me just render this, I'll pause the recording and start it up when it's done. As you can see, the water looks pretty good, it just looks a little bit more choppy now. So I'll save this render and then we can compare the two just to show you the difference. As you can see, the original waves I set up look a little bit more realistic, a little bit less choppy, because when you do go out to the ocean, you're not going to see such small ripples like this. And even though it's subtle, things like that do have a pretty large impact on the realism and perception of scale in your scenes. So just feel free to play around with this ocean displacement. It's kind of self-explanatory because you can see the effect of what you're changing in real time. So it's not one of those things where I need to run through and render off 10 different types of settings. One last thing, you'll see the waves are pretty small scale. They're not that high compared to the iceberg itself. If you want to go higher and you want your waves to be stronger, just increase the amount. I'd say for a rough deep sea ocean displacement, you'd go 1 meter on the waves. But it's totally up to you guys. It's totally up to you. Alright, so moving on, let me just close that render. I just want to explain to you how I set up water materials. Now it's pretty interesting because I've been asked quite a lot how to set up ocean and water shaders, and at the end of the day it's always been quite simple. There's not a lot of stuff you need to set up to create an actual realistic water material in V-Ray. So I've just got a default material here. Let me just reload that. When you want to create water, one thing that's useful, and I think I remember seeing Vlado even post about this when people were asking him, is just to keep a little bit of diffuse value in the water, that you just to tint the water a tiny little bit so that it does pick up a little bit of diffuse. So when you set your watercolor, just go off your reference, basically set it to the correct kind of subsurfacey type color. Then in the refraction, instead of going all the way to 255, feel free to drop that depending on how many impurities you'd think would be in the water. So a great example there is if you were looking at like an Amazon river where inside the water itself you've got lots of mud and other particles that aren't refractive, that give the water a more solid appearance. So that's where you would go down on the refractive amount. And if I just bring up the background here in the shader, you can see now that there actually is a little bit of that diffuse value coming through. So for underwater, like I was saying, that mud effect, Now that that's there, let me just quickly set this up and I'll show you how it looks in our scene. In the fog color, I'm just going to go a little bit bright. In the fog multiplier, I'm going to have to go down quite far. Can just start out with 0.01. In the refraction, I'm going to go to a little bit higher and just play with this until I've kind of got something I like. In the reflection, we're going to go full 255. Because water is such a standard material, we don't need to use a custom BRDF and a custom reflectance curve. So I'm just going to untick this button and then swap it to 1.33, which is the IOR of water. If you want, you can change the refractive glossiness, and because I do have divide shading subdivs turned off, I'm just going to lower the subdivs amount. And I'm going to bring down this glossiness to 0.5, just to blur that just a little bit. So if I apply this to the ocean now, and do another render, we'll see what happens. So as you can see, not the best result. You do need to make a couple of modifications. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into the diffuse and just ease up on the saturation a little bit. And I'm going to go a little bit brighter on the fog color and just re-render. And then I'll show you how to do it with V-Ray's Fast SSS 2 shader, which in my opinion produces a better result. So I'm not even going to let this finish because it just doesn't look good enough. So I'm just going to cancel this render and then show you how to do the same thing with the Fast SS2 shader. So inside the shader, what you can do is you can set the preset to water, then go down into the single scatter options and set it to ray traced and refractive. And if I put the background in here, I just need to increase the scatter radius, and you can see we have a refractive material now that also has all the subsurface features as well. So in my opinion, when you're doing things like dirty water and muddy water, this is a much better option to go through. And I'm pretty sure lesson 11 is going to be about foliage. So in that lesson, I'll make sure to include a little feature on getting water, because I have gotten some really photorealistic results using this method. So once again, in the scatter color, I'm just going to tint it a little bit and assign that to the ocean surface. Just increase the diffuse amount just a little bit. I'm going to back that off in a second. And render again. And you'll notice the SSS2 shader is slower to render than your typical V-Ray material. So once again, not the best example to be rendering muddy like water out in the middle of the ocean. But I will show you that in lesson 11. So let me just cancel this and set this up with a little bit more realistic settings. So I'm going to take out the diffuse component of the SSS2 shader and just introduce a little bit of blue. I'm going to tick trace reflections and make the IOR 1.33. Actually, I will just put in a little bit of a diffuse value here. I'm just going to tint it a little bit blue. And we'll see how this looks. Now, as this is rendering, you can see it looks a lot more realistic now, but I should point out that one other thing that will affect the overall appearance of your water is the ground plane that you have underneath. And depending on how bright that is, it's kind of like a fake, because you have to realize that at this level in the ocean, you're not going to see the floor. There's not going to be any light reaching it. And if there is, it's going to be so dark that it's not going to have that much of an effect on the overall appearance of the water. But when this finishes, I'll just show you what raising the color and intensity of that ground plane can actually do for your scene. And the other great thing is that unlike the last couple of lessons, the render times aren't so bad anymore. So it is not so painful to test this stuff out if you don't have a render farm. I'm just going to sample the material on the ground plane. And you can see it's quite dark. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to raise the intensity of that and give it a bit of color. And I'm going to re-render the scene. Just going to cancel that and just make it a little bit brighter. I'm just going to bring it to the surface a bit more. And we should see a little bit more of a lighter blue appearance in the water. So you can get a feel now for, just by changing that floor plane, we've added a little bit more life into the water. It doesn't look so dark and dull. So let me just cancel this. I'll duplicate it again. And I'll just make it green this time. And if I bring up Photoshop, what you can use this for is say if you wanted to create this effect of a little bit more illumination in the water, as opposed to, you can see it's quite dark here, is just playing around with those colors. And it's what I've used on production jobs also to get that effect. On top of obviously having the fog color and the SSS applied correctly. So you can see now if I zoom right inside these pixels, even though it's a bit noisy, you can see a bit of that color coming through now. So after this render is finished, then I'll move on to showing you how I created this iceberg material itself. Then after that, we'll load up the snow scene that I was working on that I wasn't completely happy with, but I'll run you through that one also. And then lastly, I'll jump into Octane and show you there also. So there you go. But I've just decided, now that I've seen this final render, that there's kind of one thing missing that I want to point out when you're working with the ocean, and that's when the sun is directly reflecting into the ocean itself. And now, because the sun is such a hard reflection in the water, you need to soften it off a little bit. So just before we move on, let me just grab this V-Ray material shader here and apply that to the scene. And you'll notice in the reflection glossiness, I've just dropped that down to 0.98. Now, even though that's not physically correct and water will be 100% mirror-like in its reflection, depending on if there's no noise I'm talking about, when it comes to rendering in 3D, you need to alter that just a little bit, just so that your not getting such harsh reflections in here. And if I zoom into a render eye, which is in the same exact scene that I set off last night, you can see the default. Sorry, I might just need to load that up again. Sorry, I've just loaded that up again. You can see in the raw render that the reflections of the sun are extremely harsh. So to get around that, what you can do is it's just a little trick. I'm going to duplicate that and blur the water. And then I'm just going to mask paint that in exactly where I want it. Obviously a retouch will go in and do this a little bit more precisely, but the difference is quite massive. Because in reality you are going to be seeing flares and pings and bloom coming off those highlights. You can do it in V-Ray yourself, but if you do notice it, just drop the reflection a little bit, add a little bit more blur in Photoshop, and then also turn on bloom and glare in the render itself and adjust the settings to what you're after. But I don't think that this bloom effect works perfectly in these situations. I prefer to do it in Photoshop. So moving on to the iceberg shader itself, once again it consists of 3 layers, and I'll just render off what each of these layers is doing and then break down why I've set it up this way for you. So let me just apply the simple diffuse material that has no subsurface or refraction. You can see if I go in here, it's non-refractive. But the reason I use a V-Ray material is because I want to have reflection that's a lot